to midnight Eastern Standard Time, as we are live on YouTube and on the flagship station, which is Rumble. Also downloaded to various podcast stations. Jay Dyer is my guest. Jay's been somewhat of a regular on the program. Jay's Analysis is his website. He's the author of a couple of books. Hollywood, what is it, Jay?
S-Truck Hollywood 1 and 2.
Thank you. And I'm impressed by the depth and the width of your scholarship. I mean, particularly in areas of religion and on areas of the modern culture. And as we move into the Great Reset and we're losing various aspects of our freedom, we're losing our property, we're going toward the old communist ideal, except it's been repackaged and reconnoitered. And of course, we're living in a world, and I want to be careful here, where we have been afraid to step outside the front door because of this mysterious disease and illness that is permeating everything. And, it's in a way, it seems to, whether or not it's a natural thing or whether or not it was created in a lab in China, it seems to fit into an agenda that was developed by the World Economic Forum. Klaus Schwab actually wrote a book specifically about this eventually happening. I see a quote from H.G. Wells back in the 1930s where he talks about the future where there will be a massive disease and a kind of a huge international development of germs. And it seems to fit an agenda by which they're going to scare the hell out of us, and we're going to give up our freedom, and we're going to shelter ourselves. And that, it's something that, I'd heard talk about this years ago, but I always didn't want to think about it because it was so unpleasant. But here we are. So, Jay, you've done some research on Galton Darwin as one of the figures that which is typical of this internationalist establishment. They like to blow the whistle on themselves. They like to do stuff right out in public, in broad daylight, with symbols, with assassinations, with stolen elections. Let's not go there, but talk about who this guy Darwin was.
Well, he comes from, as you pointed out, the Darwin family, and I'm trying to remember exactly what his relationship was. He is the grandson of Charles Darwin. And there's also an intermarriage with the Galton, Wedgwood, Huxley peoples, because they all kind of had these sort of incestuous intermarrying relationships. And he, most of the members of his family continued work in science. So they did a lot of work with X-rays and crystallography, atomics, all this kind of stuff, computers, computer science. And that led him to write a book kind of continuing the tradition of eugenics and Malthusianism, where he predicted, as many of these books do, a Malthusian catastrophe, that there wouldn't be enough resources to go around. And if we don't curb population now, then, as you said, the fear agenda kicks in. We got to scare the crap out of everybody that if we don't radically reduce population, there's not going to be enough people. And so he begins the book by saying that, science is an end in itself. Scientism is really the end, be all, end all of what man can do and achieve. And if we don't take the reins of science and do like Russell and Jonas Salk and Friedrich Capra all say, that if the scientific priest class doesn't step up to this role, then the world will be destroyed. And so it's a kind of like a salvific scientism, right? Where science has to step in and do this, or what they're calling science. It's not really science. It's really a will to power situation where they will choose who will have children, who will go into the future. It'll be done in a lab, babies coming out of test tubes, this kind of stuff. And he says that if we don't do this, again, like you said, we're going to have population explosion, and there won't be enough food to go around. And even goes so far as to say we're going to have to deal with, the second chapter is on Malthusianism, I'll put it that way. And the whole thing is just to scare everybody that there's not enough to go around.
Right.
And
right.
So, yeah, that's the basic. That's how the book begins. He kicks it off with that, and then he moves on to kind of analyzing history and pointing out revolutions in history, like Industrial Revolution, a lot like Klaus Schwab's Fourth Industrial Revolution book does. And he says the future is moving towards a new world civilization. And he talks about made up things like peak oil, which is weird because they were talking about peak oil way back before it was even a known thing. But they were saying, well, we can't get all the dinosaur juice out of the earth. So at some point that's going to run out and we're going to have austerity. And then he talks about synthetic foods and staged food crises. So it is the communist model of intentional crises, scaring everybody, terror, and then you provide the answer. And the answer is always something that fits this agenda. And he ends that chapter with talking about mutating humans, GMO humans. It brings to mind something like Isaac Asimov's Foundation. He talks about basically experimenting on humans, creating super soldiers, basically the soldiers becomes test experiments for how to better mutate man, basically. So it's a dehumanizing thing for the sake of the elite, basically. That's the first, like 3 chapters of the book.
Incredible. I mean, this really lays out it's science fiction is often a way to tell truths in a way that's slightly couched. And you get into the issue right now of the difference between science and scientism, which is a highly politicized and ideological approach to science. It goes back to, I would contend, in modern times, Blavatsky and some of her occultic research and her Theosophical Society, which was embraced by much of the elites of the world and which is the official religion of the United Nations. If you take a look at the meditation room and the Lucis Trust, which used to be the Lucifer Trust, and that, of course, is the inheritor of her movement. And basically it combined science and evolution with occult practices and beliefs. It's a very strange and amoral, if not immoral, body of work that really typifies much of our elite in the world. I mean, these are people who, they view conventional understanding of morality as being old-fashioned and something that has to be eliminated. The first head of the World Health Organization, G. Brock Chisholm, he was a Canadian psychiatrist who actually said that psychiatry was to serve the agenda of removing such things as moral ideas and belief in God, because these things stand in the way of this new scientific order.
Yep.
I mean, it goes back to the 19th century as well. I mean, Darwin certainly was a Pied Piper of this, with his theory that all of life somehow emerged out of a little pond, and that there's no creator of the universe. There certainly is no God. Everything is just the cyclical, dialectical mishmash of entities crashing into each other and creating new entities. And this is we're now in a world where this kind of immorality holds a high ground and is enhanced by some of the other things that you've talked about, Jay, with regard to transhumanism and the transformation of the human being into a kind of a hybrid that's both living and biologically enhanced and altered through technologies and through a virtual, science and through computer stuff, let's just say. We don't want to use the C word here. I think that there's no question that that's what we're looking at right now. I mean, it's right out in the open.
Yeah, he goes on in this book to be more explicit that the transformation isn't just man, but also the environment itself. So he goes into detail about geoengineering, the possibility of mutating not just man, but the environment itself through chemical and genetic modification means. And so there's an immediate denial of the notion that there is purpose in the world. Things don't have meaning and purpose and order and a design, right, that God gave them. They're just there. They're just mutating. It's just matter in motion. And so there's nothing wrong with doing whatever you want. But if there is a creator, then it stands to reason that not everything is doable or should be done, right? And that's always been the battle between the notion of theism and this radical scientism attitude, which is that we must transgress the boundaries for the sake of so-called knowledge. But if you get rid of all values, then there's no point or purpose to science either. If there's no values at all, if you can't make value judgments, and I think to make value judgments, you need a religion or a position that can explain those standards, that gives a basis for metaphysical principles, ethical principles, and so forth. So theism does that. But if you have an atheistic worldview, there isn't a basis for value judgments. It's all purely subjective. And so really the purpose of science it's not purposeful, right? It's in the metaphysical term, it's dysteleological. It does not have an end. It's just there. No action is any different than any other action on any scale or on any standard of values. There's no such thing as values, basically. This is what Hume is always known for, because he would point out, being more consistent than most of his fellow atheists, is that you can't get an ought from an is. If everything in the world is just states of affairs, they just are what they are. It's just matter in motion. You can't ever derive an ethical ought or a value judgment from those states of affairs. And that's the root of the problem with this attitude of, it just immediately becomes might makes right. It immediately becomes, and Galton Darwin doesn't really have any problem going in that direction. I don't think he's very interested in philosophy. Most people who are proponents of scientism, they don't care about philosophical arguments or theistic arguments. They discard that, and it's really just figuring out this pragmatism. Yeah, figuring out how do I exert my will in a sort of dominance way.
Well, I mean, obviously, science has to intersect with reason, and reason comes from God. It's reason that makes us different from all other living beings.
Absolutely.
Our awareness that we're alive, our awareness of who we are, and of our role in the world. I mean, a sense of purpose. That's what separated us. That's when we developed a soul. That's when man developed logos, as they say in Greek. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, the obvious proof of that is that it's a perfectly reasonable thing to research nuclear science, but it's not reasonable to have nuclear bombs in your backyard. You don't just drop bombs, or you don't do gain of function research. I mean, in fact, even President Obama recognized that when he banned it out of Fort Detrick in 2014, because it was too dangerous. And so we had certain scientists, we're not going to mention who, that apparently decided to offshore it and promote it in a country that is our avowed enemy. I mean, I don't know what kind of morality. I suppose that's, again, science is science, and all this is true. You can create maybe a super virus that can wipe out a third of the population of the planet. That's scientific. But when you don't have a basic structure of morality and ethics, which emanates out of reason, then you're going to have things run amok. And I think that's what's, that has been the hallmark of much of our scientific elite, which I think operates almost like, if not is, a secret society. That, one of the proofs I would point to on that is the Nazi scientists. Mengele lived his life free in I think Argentina. He passed away of natural causes, and his mentor von Verscher, and I came across this when I did my research for my book, The Nazi Connection to Islamic Terrorism. He was one of the most ghoulish scientists, and he got off scot-free. I mean, he just got a slap on the wrist after the war, and he went back to work at the university in Munster. He died of natural causes in the 1970s. All these people basically got off because they're part of this, this sort of international fraternity of scientists who are above any actual consequences in life. And these are the people that are staffing not only the management of the pandemic, but they're all over the World Economic Forum. And, they're the ones who are going to, they wrap themselves in the same cloak of righteousness, like that somehow they're smarter than the rest of us, and that they're going to do good. They're going to eradicate poverty by probably eradicating people. Yeah. Anyways,
well, it's funny you said that, because right now I'm reading the third in C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, and in part 3 called That Hideous Strength, there's a society that's created, and it's called NICE. It's the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments. It has the acronym NICE, and they recruit scientists to join their organization, and they have a public face that's PR and everything, but the secret inner core knows that what they want to do is continue the Nazi eugenics program, but they have to just repackage it and resell it. And they eventually get the main character that they're sort of duping into this. They finally get him to the point where he wants to join, and they're like, yeah, well, we can't tell everybody that we want to kill everybody, right? We can't say that. We have to make it very have to make it palatable.
Well, I mean, after World War II, the whole thing took on a certain stench. But I think that it's safe to say that eugenics just repackaged itself, and you had major figures like Julian Huxley, who was the founder of UNESCO, who was a major eugenist before the war. I mean, Darwin was a major eugenist. They believed that there were superior species of human beings. And if you look at their science, it makes sense that they would believe that, because
the next chapter is about the species of man. And what Charles Galton Darwin says is that there is no such thing as a species of man. He's like, that's a generic concept. We use this word, but it's not something that it's actually out there. Man is really just another form of a monkey or a dog or whatever.
Right.
And so he says, but at the same time, this is a funny thing. Here's some logic. Like, he also says the elite will evolve into a new higher species. So I thought there weren't species, but the elite will evolve into a higher species.
It's a superior race, basically.
Yeah, no, that's this whole chapter, Homo sapiens, is about. He says that from reading Gregor Mendel, and who, by the way, I think wasn't his view shown to be false, that the parents don't necessarily in a deterministic way determine everything about the child. Wasn't that Mendel's view? I can't remember. I may be mixing.
Well, I think that was Lamarck.
Okay,
Mendel, I think, he was actually a Catholic priest, and I think he was the founder of modern genetics. I actually think he was one of the good guys. But look, the whole idea here is that if you believe that man is evolving or devolving, because if they're evolving, they must also devolve, then we're all at different rungs of the ladder in terms of evolution, and that there are some groups of people
exactly.
who are more evolved than others.
That's what he says, right?
Yeah, and Darwin was very explicit about this. He viewed the English as more evolved than the Irish.
Right.
He viewed the Aboriginal people of Australia as half human, half ape. You could go through his diary and his observations of Native Americans when they, on his trip on the Beagle, where he talked about this. And that it would make sense if you take a look at their particular view, as opposed to the religious view, which is that all men are created equal. And the Torah, the Bible, actually says explicitly that men and women, it says, not just men and women, were created in the image of God.
Right.
That we are born equal, we die equal, we have equal souls. I mean, we're not equal in terms of our experiences in life and things like luck, but we're equal under the American system. I think codified this idea with the principle that we are equal under the law. Doesn't always work out that way, but the principle is there. And, there's no group of people, no person that is biologically superior or inferior to another person.
Yeah, I think that when you get rid of the philosophical ideas like the notion of essences or natures, for example, all human beings have the nature that they have. And I believe God made all men in his image. Now, humans can deface that image through certain actions, but considered in themselves, humanity possesses human nature, and human nature by Genesis is something good, something that God created in his image. So in that respect, everybody has the same rights, the same duties, the same calling in various ways, not in terms of their life, but to, live according to the moral law and so forth. And if they have the faculty of reasoning, to function and live on the basis of reasoning, as you said. And what you notice in the next chapter with Galton Darwin is that he says that in our view, only the elite should have children. In fact, not only should the poor not have children. He says that it's the duty of the elite to sterilize the poor, because he says everybody who's in poverty is a parasite on society, and no longer should the elite. So now it's like, well, wait a minute, are the elite just rich people? Because I mean, you can be degenerate and be rich. I mean, so, or is it that are the elite the, like, you know,
well, how does he define
Lundgren? Is that who the elite are? As you see, it's like, well, which one is it? Is it just rich people, or is it like the buff dude who can like run 100 miles? Or so it's just as arbitrary categories of what the elite are.
Well, how do they define elite? I mean, because you're right.
Well, it's different things, right?
I mean, I think that it's people who are kind of initiated into some sort of an oath-giving society. That's my opinion, but
yes. Okay.
You know, there's some. It's literally somebody who's been tapped on the shoulder, and who is part of some sort of an elite society, and they don't have to. They don't have to necessarily be rich either.
Right,
you know,
right. Sometimes, yeah, it's not just blood; it's also brains. Somebody describes it as the bloods and the brains that are involved.
Or it's just people who are willing to surrender a certain level of their personal freedom, in order of receiving these awards that accompany an acceptance of a certain set of views, and that the rest of us want to be part of this, even though we're on the outer portico, because that's where the beautiful people are. That's where the goods are. That's where you get the awards. And if you're not part of it, you get punished. It's a very subtle thing. It's sort of a natural sociological thing in any society for people to want to conform to the elite in power. That's why, our founding fathers set up a constitutional system so that we could check and balance that power. But I think that that system has tipped in favor of a permanent elite. And I get into the history of this in a new book that's coming out, where I think it happened in the election of 1912, but that's another story. We can go there. But, the American system of balance became permanently unbalanced at that point. And we did develop an informal aristocracy of elites, and that they are people who communicate in various levels with each other informally, and they have formed an informal government that is becoming increasingly a world government.
Yes, definitely. In fact, he goes on to say that the formation of this kind of a attitude will be necessary, because if his argumentation, I'm not saying it's true, but his argumentation is that if that's not done, then the mongoloids and the dummies and the poor people will take over the world and destroy the elite. Which, I mean, I don't think he really thinks that. Maybe he does, but it's just such a weird justification or rationale. And then he goes on to say that the weirdest part in this book, which I didn't see in other texts like this, was the section on the bloodlines. And he's very emphatic about the importance of maintaining bloodlines. And he says that all we're doing.
That's a real thing. I mean, that's not, I think so. I mean, that seems to be, you mentioned the kind of the intermarriage between the Darwins and the Wedgwoods. I mean, these English elitists, they were all part of the Pellenon Society. I mean, you have that amongst certainly European aristocracy. Yes. You have it among Jewish aristocracy in New York. The Lehmans and the Seligmans and the Schiffs, they all married into each other's families. They kept everything in the house. I mean, this is actually something that probably to an extent exists among the elites of any society. Right.
Yeah, he actually says that. He says that, first of all, the maintenance and control of the sexual desire will have to be completely put under science. And he says that science will, in a numeric way, determine, how many of the society will be even be able to have kids. He says the majority will be sterilized. Things like IQ and wealth and status will determine whether you're allowed to have kids. And he says, but the main concern will be bloodlines, because the elites have always controlled breeding. The notion of breeding was a secret, he says, elite science. This is why he says there was always royal bloodlines. And he actually goes back to to Ptolemy, and he says that this is why the elites practiced incest. So he actually says This is why the incest is done. He's not saying it's bad. He's just saying that the elite do this to keep it in the family, so to speak.
Right.
And what is the family but just a smaller enclave of a kind of a secret society? It's the same point. I'm not saying every family is inherently a secret society, but the elite royal bloodline view is a secret society. And he says that the model is the same from from Ptolemy to the Romans. And he says the noble Germanic tribes did this. The Brahmins did this. And he has a section on the Jewish approach, but he doesn't say necessarily that they were dominated by this idea. He says that it's a long history of continuous persecution, and it has led to the belief that this has been an important factor in their qualities, which they have maintained through the sort of in-group, out-group preferences. So he's saying that not so much. He's just saying the Jewish attitude towards keeping it in the Jewish faith has helped them preserve. And he says they're an example of the principle that we will use to create, literally the end of that chapter is a master race. He says we will breed the master race. And he says, if you want to understand what this really is, he says, just read Plato's Republic. The master race will be modeled on Plato's Republic. You'll have the elite at the top of the pyramid, and then warrior class, then you have the proles. So,
I mean, that seems to be the model. I mean, that was also the model in Rousseau's social contract.
Yep.
The philosopher king.
At the end of Impact of Science and Society, Russell says the whole model is just Plato's Republic.
Right. Also, the model of the Prussian state, where you had three tiers of education. You had like the elites, the very few would get the real education. And then there'd be a middle education system for people who would be practical, would be the workers, the craftsmen who would provide the actual work to make an economy move. And then you'd have the vast majority who would get the simpletons education. I don't know, they had a word for it in German, that would basically, be focused on sensate pleasure and, entertainment and, skits and plays and fun things. And they would use look-say methodology of reading so that people couldn't read too well. And that basically you would keep, the Roman concept, I suppose, of bread and circus, where you would keep them pacified and kind of almost infantilized.
Oh, he has a section on that too, where he says that the society will just be given so much drugs and entertainment that they will basically become sexless, sterilized worker drones. And then they will breed themselves out. They won't breed, so they'll go out of existence. And then the master race will rule. And then he says they will control everything through continental unions that will be set up. I mean, it's literally reads like the most conspiratorial book you've ever read. It's just
incredible. We'll have to get this because, I mean, the Prussian system was brought to this country by some of the great early, so-called frontier thinker educators like John Dewey, and Johns Hopkins University was a major incubator for this. And, then you, of course, you had the people like Kinsey who introduced sex as being separated from, actual sacred relationship. It all became like a commodity as a way to sort of infantilize people and to, I mean, look, I don't want to get into trouble here, but this has a lot to do with promoting homosexuality and transgenderism and all of that. People are not getting into whether or not people have a right to do whatever they want to do. But the point is, we're talking about, in a sense, the agenda of promoting sexuality without procreation, without a sacred commitment. That's all. I mean, I'm just to bring it up. I mean, this is no big secret here. It's just this seems to be pretty obvious.
Yeah, there's that Berelson memo, the Jaffe-Berelson memo says that very thing. And that was the Rockefeller plan sent out to all the Planned Parenthood organizations in the country. And it's a famous memo, and it says that very thing. It says promote every form of alternative lifestyle, because it doesn't matter which one, any of them work to reduce the population. And we don't want people pair bonding and having offspring. That's essentially what it says.
That's right. And that's what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about not tolerating anybody, just for the YouTube censors to know that, I mean, I'm not in any way attempting to criticize or insult anyone's personal choices. It's just, we're looking at broader social agendas here. I'm a student of sociology. You're a student of religion. We're looking at, at these issues in that context. So bringing things up to today, you have the international pandemic where we've accepted things like lockdowns and mandates of all sorts, not done by elected governments, but by the sort of elite scientific groups who get to now control us. And even though those things have sort of seemed to have gone away, I thank, by the way, the Canadian truckers for that. I don't think it would have happened had it not been for them. God bless them. Because when they went out and they started to protest, the whole world responded. I mean, you had protests and breaking out in countries all around the world. Even Israel had protests. I mean, France, Australia. And I think that politicians took a look at that and they said, we have to stop this because otherwise we're going to have a real workers' revolution that could affect the world, not some phony workers' revolution like Occupy Wall Street, but some, which is run by somebody writing a few checks. But this was real people going out and saying,
yeah,
we're not going to go for this. We're not abiding by these rules. And so they backed off. And I think that we're now having more freedom. However, I would caution and point out that the precedent was set for unprecedented government seizures on an international level. And they're not going to relinquish that. They hold on to that, to pull out in the future after some other catastrophe, some other event that might happen. I mean, they're not, those powers are still in the books. They've usurped them and nobody, I mean, RFK Jr. actually wrote a good book about this. I mean, it's worth reading about Dr. Fauci that, once governments, and his father told him this when he was young, that being the former Senator Robert F. Kennedy, that the government is corrupt and that once they get certain powers, they'll never let go of it.
Right.
So that's the world we're in now. And it has everything to do with the World Economic Forum and their agenda going forward, which I think intersperses with transhumanism. So and I've heard you talk about this, Jay. So talk a little bit about what that agenda is.
Well, the WEF actually comes out of a plan on the part of Kissinger and some of the U.S. Pentagon CIA elite. It's called the Harvard Project, and they got the idea to recruit Klaus. I believe when he was at Columbia or one of those, he was actually at Harvard or Columbia, one of the U.S. Eastern Seaboard universities. And it's kind of an offshoot of Bilderberg. Klaus had also been head of Bilderberg steering committee for a while. And then this came about as more of a public face of Bilderberg, but it really has its roots not in anything European per se, but in the U.S. of the CIA. So the idea would be to continue to promote the same ideas in a more public way. And why it stepped up, I'm not really sure. I mean, maybe Bilderberg served its purpose. I don't really know why they did that, strategically speaking, but for whatever reason, the Klaus, Davos, and all that really stepped up to the front of the room when it came to the last 2 years. And I noticed, as I said, that there was a website that they had a subscription service to back a couple of years ago. I don't know if it still exists, but you could sign on and put your email in. It wasn't like a paid thing, and it had everything laid out, like how they were going to rewrite, revamp, and restart all of society. And it was in every area. It was big circles that you could click on, every little circle of this, every little section of the circle. And it was like education and banking and, money transfers. Everything was going to be redone. And it started making more sense why Klaus had written books like, Fourth Industrial Revolution in 2018 or 19, still prior to, March 2020. And it was basically calling for a lot of the things that the CUF led to, right? Everybody was clamoring for the things that they said these kinds of big events lead to. And one thing I've noticed, whether it's going back to things that you see that the revolutionaries in France do, or what we read in Galton Darwin, you'll notice there's a constant created fear narrative about things that might be to a degree real, but they're just blown up to epic proportions, right? And whatever COVID is, or whatever that virus is, it's not as extreme as they made it, but they used it. It was a perfect launching board, for ultimately, I think, for the next phase of what they want to bring in, and that was moving things towards automation. And I was just listening to both lectures that Klaus and his understudy Noah Yuval Harari had done, where they said, basically, I'm summarizing, but the clips say this, it's basically that the whole purpose of the last 2 years was to move towards technocracy. That's it. So COVID was really not
to automatize everything, to basically
move to the next. And it's not like they just now achieved it, but the next decade is to move in that direction. COVID was the launching board to do that. And so basically to bring in technocracy, transhumanism, and then there's, separate goals for 2030 and then goals for 2050. I don't know how agreed all of them are on the years and the goals. There might be debate over that, but typically you notice they will lay these things out, like, Agenda 21, Agenda 2030. And I was just today reading back some of the old 90s agreements, the Rio agreement of Bush, the biological diversity assessment of the UN. They're all the same. Like, all of this stuff is the same stuff, and it's all the same plan. It's all that man is bad, man is the problem. It's global warming became climate change. It was global freezing, then it was global warming, then it was climate change. So it just gets rebranded. And I believe
they didn't have to explain it every time the weather got cold. Right. I mean,
and to me, it's just really obvious. I haven't been around that long, but I can remember back to the 80s and 90s, and I can remember seeing the way it was branded and sold back then, and how they just sort of rebranded it to something else when it didn't fit what was obvious.
Well, they had different things. I remember acid rain. I remember the ozone layer opening, the hole in the ozone layer. I remember the chemical on apples. I tend to be a little bit green when it comes to the environment, but these sort of massive international hysterical campaigns, I take a bit of a jaundiced eye to it. I had an expert actually explain to me global warming off the record, somebody who was on his way to an international conference, an MIT professor. And he said to me, yeah, global warming is happening, but we're talking like, over centuries of tiny changes. And that, we have plenty of time to develop technologies to counter air pollution. It's not this thing like with Al Gore, the sky is falling,
exactly.
penny, like the world's about to burn it.
Well, back when I was in my undergrad, I remember my professor, a German professor, said to write a review of that movie, Inconvenient Truth. And I was already kind of questioning this mainstream narrative about climate change and the polar bears on the icebergs and all that. So I wrote a whole bunch of stuff and wrote a critique of it. She gave me automatic F. Like, she didn't even consider the argument. It was like an automatic F on the paper. And I'm like, so I started realizing, well, this is kind of like a narrative. I was like 22, something like that. And I'm thinking, well, this is like a thing you have to accept. It's like it's a dogma and you're not supposed to question it. And then not too long after that, there was the famous IPCC email leaks where they had fudged the data and admitted that.
Right, in East Anglia, right? Mm-hmm. That's right. And not only that, but I think the same things happened with the management of COVID, that the scientific community will reward scientists who do the research that has the results they want.
Exactly.
And they'll punish scientists that won't. We could look at the COVID. There are very important, respected doctors and immunologists, and we could mention some names. Maybe we shouldn't, but they have been purged because they don't agree with an official version. In one case, one of these doctors actually was one of the inventors of the vaccine. And he had a couple of minor criticisms, mild suggestions in terms of its application, he's been purged. So, there's something about this. I actually think that a lot of this accelerated due to the thousands of pages that make up what we call Obamacare. I think that Obamacare resulted in doctors and medical personnel and medical establishments losing their independence. They're no longer free. Your doctor is not free to say things to you that as a patient that they might have been free to do in the past.
Interesting.
It's just a theory of mine. I don't know, but
well, it makes sense. And that's why there would be a lot more compliance then.
Yeah.
Where they wouldn't want to speak out on the issues of the last few years. Exactly.
And other agendas of this, this World Economic Forum is to basically fulfill the dream of Karl Marx. We could talk about it going back to Adam Weishaupt.
Yeah, you won't have any property.
Abolishing property. That's right. The only people that are going to own property, and this is part of this phenomena of, BlackRock and Fidelity and huge international combines of wealth buying up private homes, buying up Bill Gates, buying up hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland and leaving it empty. This is, it's essentially, ending the institution of the family-owned farm and the family-owned home. And,
I remember years ago, one of the first things I'd read back from people from like the John Birch Society back in the late 90s, like 99.
Sure.
People were making a big deal about the rewilding project. And at that time, the fear was the federal government's going to do the rewilding. Well, now it looks like that project's going to be all these private zillionaires buying the land and then forcing out.
It was like the green. I remember the green passages. They showed a map of the United States with all of the crisscrossing green spots.
Right.
And look, they changed the laws that were passed by Congress with regard to waterways, which was, that the government would have some regulation over navigable waterways, some bureaucracy in this administrative state, which is what we're talking about. I think Steve Bannon accurately named it that, of this kind of like quasi-public entity that has basically, rules us today.
Mm-hmm.
They removed the word navigable from the law, which means that any body of water, even if you have a little puddle in your backyard, is now under the regulation of the federal government.
Wow.
Because it originally was supposed to be, the major ports and the Mississippi. Which is reasonable, but now it's in other words, they've expanded it, and of course that gets into an issue of what is the administrative state, and it's really basically a transfer of governing powers from elected officials who have to answer the Constitution and who are elected by the people to these sort of quasi-sovereign agencies and entities, including now the international agencies that are not accountable, that are faceless, that are not necessarily American, and that can do pretty much whatever the hell they want to do.
Yeah, well, I remember the whole CUFID narrative was at one point they even said, we're going to hand this over to the Rockefeller Foundation, the United Nations. They're going to run and tell us what to do. And they sort of became this de facto entity that would tell the CDC and supposedly all the doctors what you're supposed to do, right? It's just bizarre, but not bizarre if you understand, kind of what we're talking about. And it reminds me too, have you ever seen the articles that point out, I don't remember where I read this, it was a long time ago, but that one of the earliest proponents of the green idea was actually, I think, Ingalls. Have you heard this?
He talked about primitive socialism as
well, that he had this idea that the environment could be used. I need to dig that essay up, that
that's interesting.
Environmentalism could be something that rallied the masses to overthrow and this kind of stuff. It's pretty wild, but he was ahead of his time when it came to techniques and tactics.
And he also, at Marx's gravesite, he credited Darwin for much of what Marx came up with, and in terms of a dialectical. Darwin's biological dialectic, which was the move toward a super race and a super species. Right. Marx applied that to economy. The stages until you reach the utopia, which was world communism, where the entire planet becomes one gigantic ant colony. Anyway, but Jay, I want to, kind of wildly change the subject here, because we're reaching, I don't like to go too much over an hour. And I want to talk about Judaism. I want to talk about, which is something I personally care a lot about, and its intersection with Christianity, historically, theologically, if you will. And I've heard you often talk about your religion, which I believe is Eastern Orthodox, and your religious journey, and you've done comparative interviews and talks with regard to different Christian sects, including Catholicism, and different Protestant sects, as well as Islam and Eastern religions. But I want to just talk about Judaism only because in my interviews with Dr. E. Michael Jones, who I think is a brilliant thinker and scholar, but I think he's way out to lunch on this one issue, which is Judaism. He's written an entire book on the topic, where it isn't really too much about Jews in that book. It's mostly about his argument against Protestantism. It's an interesting book, but he insists that on adhering to what I think was, it's safe to say, somewhat of a conventional Christian view that existed certainly before World War II, and not amongst all Christians. But it was the view that the Jewish people are cursed because we are responsible for because we killed God, because we are responsible for the death of Jesus, who is Christ. And thus we are, the early Christian church, I think particularly St. Augustine, who was a great theologian, he actually put in place a system by which the Jewish people could live in Europe, and yet under what is called in Latin the Sicut Judaeus, which was that while we we believed in God, and we adhered to the what Christians call the Old Testament, what we call the Torah or the Tanakh, at the same time, because of our culpability in the death of Jesus, we are not allowed to hold positions of influence. We're not allowed to, I suppose in a system of Sicut Judaeus, I wouldn't be allowed to do this program right now, because we're cursed, and because our influence is corrupting and evil.
I have a book on that by a woman who I'd not heard that about him. There's a book that's really good on that topic by I think her name is Fredrickson, and her book is Augustine and the Jews, and I think she takes issue with that. So I'm not saying that there may be an area of Augustine where he talks about that I haven't read. He wrote thousands of pages. I've read many of his works. I don't recall the origin of that principle in him. It could be, but in that woman's book, she argues that isn't the case. But again, that I may be wrong about that.
All right. My source again is Jones, and he's certainly not an unimpeachable source. I think also I read The Sword of Constantine by James Carroll.
I've read that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think he also talks about Sicut Judaeus, if I'm not mistaken, and Augustine. And look, in a sense, the principle did allow the Jewish people to live in Europe for thousands of years, and the relationship, I think, between Judaism and Christianity was always one of kind of a love-hate relationship.
This is the one I'm thinking of.
All right.
She deals with this question in an interesting way that you might find interesting.
Yeah, I will. I'll look it up.
But again, you may be right that so my understanding is there would be these periods where things would sort of rile up, and you would get disputes and debates, and you would get fights. There were Jewish gangs. There were also Christian emperors and people who would, say you can't practice your Judaism here. Mm-hmm. So it's not a like all-encompassing thing in my view. I think you have periods where there's these disputes. So I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all problem or thing where we say, oh, it's all this. For example,
I agree.
It's not my view that the New Testament teaches that there's a curse upon an entire people group or biological descendants because of an act in the past. I mean, scripture itself says that, even in the Ten Commandments, that he holds people accountable to the second and third generation.
Right.
But God's mercy is upon 1,000 generations. So I've not heard a view that all of the people collectively are guilty. So I think that in the New Testament, when it says that, I think there's a lot of statements where Christ speaks to the generation that's there, and he says, upon this generation. And some Protestants and weird people think that the word generation somehow means like all of the people of the lineage. No, it's talking about that group of people at that time. And so in the New Testament, there's two things, from my view, there's two things that are said. Sometimes Paul says that people that are persecuting the church are guilty. They claim to be Jews, but they're not really Jews, meaning in his view that they're not circumcised in heart. They're externally pretending to be, or they're self-righteous, but they're not truly Jews,
right,
even though they claim to be. And I think there's other passages where he says in Romans, for example, that there are still blessings and there is still honor for Jews as a people, as a group, because of the promises of God given to Abraham and to that people group. So I think that in my view, there's a both and in the New Testament. It's not an either or. A lot of people get caught up in, okay, well, this text says this, so we have to like think that all of the people group is guilty collectively of a sin. And I don't think that's true. But at the same time, clearly there are differences between Orthodox and Jews. And in the first, second century, you see the groups go in different ways, right? And at the time of the New Testament, there's debates about this new movement, debates about the status of Jesus as the Messiah. And this is, in my understanding, this is where you start to get, this is around the time of the what we call rabbinical Judaism. I know you could go back to Ezra, you could go back to further than that period, but when there's no temple, the diaspora leads to the prominence of the rabbinical tradition because of the inability to have the temple and the sacrifices.
Sure.
And so that's my understanding, is when the groups really go in complete different directions, even though, yes, there are still elements that are held in common, like the Torah, like Isaiah, different Old Testament prophets and so forth. But I don't
believe in God, right?
Well, and I don't think, but I don't think that you get, so for example, in St. John Chrysostom's day, he wrote some sermons that were very
virulently anti-Jewish. Yeah.
But there was gangs that were going around, right? And they were responding to.
Oh yeah. No, I think that there was a fallout, there was a falling out between two sects that were both claiming to inherit the Jewish covenant. And that there were some very nasty things said on both sides. I mean, on the one side, you had St. John Chrysostom, as you point out. He delivered scathing sermons saying the Jewish, the women are whores and the men are effeminate, and then this and that. And on the other side, you had the author of a book called The Book of Jesus, which said some very unpleasant things about Jesus. So look, I mean, I think that a lot of that had to do with the politics of the time, and it seeped into the religion, and it created bitterness. I mean, obviously, it seems to me. But I think at the end of the day, if we look at the theology, Jesus himself, on a number of occasions, said that the covenant between God and the children of Israel is forever. And I believe that that's in the book of Acts. I think it's in the book of Matthew, that he, and the Jewish people have reassessed Jesus. I think that traditionally, the Jews always viewed Jesus as a heretic, and as, in the same way that the Roman Catholic Church viewed Jan Hus as a heretic, right? I mean, or Martin Luther as a heretic. But I think that starting in the 19th century, there was a reassessment in that we came to view Jesus as a devout Jew who was sincere and who adhered to the Torah, and that there were two schools of Jewish thought in his lifetime, the Hillel school and the Shammai school. And that Jesus was a Shammai follower in many ways, more than a Hillel follower, whereas normative Judaism leans more toward Hillel, which is, I guess you might say, a little bit more liberal in terms of theology. And that, some of the very strong Christian positions on even issues of today, like abortion or like the homosexuality or some other things, that comes from the Shammai position, which is also part of Judaism. It's as valid as Hillel. We have those arguments. If you go to a Talmudic academy, they actually have debates where some guys are Hillel, some guys are Shammai, and they'll debate. But it generally, we lean toward the Hillel view, whereas Jesus seemed to have been more Shammai, and I think that that's reflected in certain elements of Christianity today.
Interesting.
And the difference, yeah, just the theory. And also that Jesus was crucified by the Romans, not by the Jews. I mean, I just think that's a fact of history.
Right. I think if my reading the New Testament, I think there is the New Testament places guilt on multiple people and groups. So there's an alliance between Herod and Rome to do the crucifixion. Right.
That's
a lot of Jews didn't like Herod, so I wouldn't think that they're not collectively guilty. The collective guilt element comes in when the crowd is there saying, give us Barabbas, let his blood be on us and our children.
That's right.
So that's the text of the supposed collective guilt. But after that event, you have Paul saying in Romans 4 and 3 and 4 that the covenant and the gifts and the promises to the Jews were not invalidated necessarily by the action of the people of that time. And then he goes on in Romans 11, in our view, and this is not just me, but every church father I've read, they believe that there is a future. I know you probably don't believe this, but from our perspective, one of the reasons that we can't say that there's no such thing as Judaism, or it's gone, or that we can't still have respect and allow Judaism to exist, is because we believe there is a future conversion. Now, that's not the like Zionist premillennial charismatic Christian Protestant view. This is a different view. I don't know. We don't know how that will come about. I don't know if that means that it will be some modern state of Israel that will convert. But in our view, the reasoning of Paul is that because there is a future hope and place for Israel, then we can't negate or say that there's like a collective guilt that crosses out the possibility of Jews believing in Christ or that future reconciliation. That's my understanding.
Okay. I mean, I think that also, I mean, at the time of Jesus's lifetime, Israel was under the jackboot of the Roman Empire. I mean, they had literally, Herod was gone at that point. They had abolished, I mean, Pontius Pilate was the dictator. He represented the Roman emperor. And he was particularly brutal. I mean, the two sources on that are Josephus and Philos Alexander, who both wrote literally about Pilate as being a particularly tough guy. He was executing people left and right, almost to the point where even it became too much even for the Romans, who recalled him after he had executed Samaritans on Mount Gerizim. This is after the crucifixion. And I mean, I think that he represented the Roman Empire. One of the most important conversations in the history of the world was when Jesus came before him and he said, "Who are you? Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "I answer to a higher authority." And at that moment, Jesus really became, I think, virtually the Messiah, at least. I mean, because he stood up as one man against the power of this state, of the earthly power of man. And he said, "I answer to God. I don't answer to, these forces, And I think he's inspired all of us ever since. Every human being looks to that and says, yeah, I don't answer to the state. I answer to God. And to me, he struck. It was a revolutionary moment. It was a moment of consciousness, and I think it made Jesus probably the most important human being who ever lived. I mean, putting aside the question of divinity. But I think, and it was within an hour of that statement that he was crucified. And I think ever since then, a lot of people have been crucified who have stood up to the power of the state. And when he did that, he stood up for all of us. So, I mean, I tend to believe in the what's called the dual covenant idea, that in a sense Christianity was grafted into the covenant because of the ministry of Jesus, and that Jesus was a true adherer to the Torah. He said on a number of occasions that not a single jot or tittle of the Torah will ever be changed.
Mhm.
It's God's word, and it's forever. And that because of that, I think he created a sect that grafted a huge portion of humanity into the covenant.
Mhm.
And that really led to a form of Judaism to spread across the world, and which created the United States, and it created our modern Western civilization. So, I know that, most Jews don't agree with me on this. Probably, certainly most Christians don't agree with me on this, but I've read a little bit on it, and I think that there are a number of people who do see it that way.
That's interesting. I mean, I think that what I was trying to outline, you could say, is a form of a dual covenant. The only caveat would be that, from our perspective, we would say that we think Orthodox Christianity is the continuity and fulfillment of Judaism. And so while we can't say that Jews shouldn't exist or can't have an existence or can't be who they are, we think that it's more like according to Romans 11, we're waiting for them to come over to our side, basically.
Understood, yeah.
And the way Paul talks about that grafting in and grafting out, he says that the branch isn't actually the Gentiles, like they were grafted in.
Mhm.
And he speaks of it like eventually that when Jews understand that what is given to us is actually their property, that will partly be what motivates Jews to accept Christianity. So that's what I think is
Okay.
the correct approach to the dual sense. But I think that there is a way to understand that to where it's not, in my view, it's not that the Mosaic administration itself is salvific, but that it points to Christ. It's not done away or canceled out, but that it's still there pointing to what we think is the fulfillment. That's my take on it.
Yeah, and I think that in a sense we have a different take on it, in that Judaism views, and my source on this is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who said that the Christian is saved through the sacrifice of Jesus, and whereas the Jew, we strive to be worthy of being saved. It's a faith of works, really, that we strive to know God through study of the Torah, through doing good deeds, through family values, through education, through trying to improve our own spiritual life, and as such being a light unto the rest of the world. And that it's just a different understanding. I don't think that they are mutually exclusive either, because I think that's also partially the Christian mission as well. But I just think that there's just a slightly different take on it, and I believe that God has a purpose for the Jews. I think that we provided a spiritual backbone for Christian Europe, for 1,000 years, and that it's a miracle that the state of Israel was recreated 2,000 years later. And if you look at some rabbis who have studied, not a subject that I know about or I endorse, but numerology, you can see that that in the book of Deuteronomy, it says that the state of Israel in Jewish years, but if you correspond that to Gregorian years, would be reestablished in 1948. So, to my way of thinking, it's a miraculous event that the end times, if you will, in a Jewish understanding, happens in the year 6000 on the Jewish calendar. And right now we're in 5,950, 40, I don't know. It probably won't happen in my lifetime, maybe in yours, you're a younger guy, but according to this understanding, it's coming. And it'll be
I didn't know that about the calendar.
Yeah, it'll be the Messianic age, which will
Interesting.
be 1,000 years of peace. But again, I'm not. I don't know about these things. These are.
Well, I did. You said Heschel. I really enjoyed his Sabbath book. I read that.
Oh yeah,
years
excellent.
ago, and believe it or not, that quite a few Orthodox people read that Sabbath book, because in the Orthodox Church you have a lot of people in Protestant groups about, oh, you don't keep the Sabbath. You don't. Well, actually, the Saturday liturgy in the Orthodox Church, it gives reference and reverence to the Sabbath. So actually, when we go to church on Saturday, there's a recognition of the Sabbath of Genesis. And it was actually at an Orthodox bookstore where I picked up that Abraham Heschel book on the Sabbath, and it's really good.
Oh, it's extraordinary. And it gets into the measurement of time as an abstract value.
And how time can be holy. Yeah.
That's right. As opposed to in Judaism, the issue of space and of place is actually less important. I mean, the number one, this is his theory, is believing in a creator of the universe, of God, who separated existence and who is supernatural as the creator of the natural world. And then the second principle is the measurement of time. The third principle is space, which is that Moses said, "You shall worship God by means of this tabernacle," and there'd be eventually a temple, which is not mentioned, by the way, in the Torah, as a way sort of for man who is not capable spiritually to understand, not that we are now, we're not, but to understand the greater belief in a creator of the universe that you can't see, that is not something that's tangible. So they created a temple. But the temple was not essential to Jewish worship, never was. It's there, it's part of it. But, it's always been, it's been built and it's been destroyed 2 times.
Yeah, that's an argument made in the New Testament. So,
well, the New Testament,
because there's a debate in Acts 15 about how to receive Gentile converts, and one of the arguments that's made is that, well, if you could be righteous in the time of Noah, and if the Noahic covenant had, not as many expectations and strictures as the Mosaic covenant did, then it only seems fair, the reasoning goes in Acts 15, that Gentile converts should be received in no more than what was necessary for Noah to be righteous. That's the argument that they make. But we would say the temple is a good thing, because it had a very important purpose of a lot of symbolism. There's actually I read a good book by a Kabbalist that it almost reads like a Christian interpretation. It's a Kabbalistic commentary on Exodus I read many years ago. I don't know what your views on like mystical.
I know it has a role. I mean, it's a way to understand God. I mean, it has to be handled with a lot of care, because there's people because
you go crazy with it.
It can drive you. You can literally become insane, and also it could fall in the hands of people who do not have the right motivation. I mean,
there was a book I was going to ask you about that.
Jewish tradition says that you shouldn't study Kabbalah until you're over 40 years old.
Right? Yeah.
You have a profession, you have a family, you have children, you've got, that you've reached a level of spiritual awareness, and you have a reputation in a community that, there's all these conditions before you can even start to approach Kabbalah, because it's something that's been abused. There's something that's been corrupted by people who are looking for like some kind of an easy, quick, answer and a religious fix, if you will. And I mean, it becomes almost like the opposite of its intent. So it's a study that has to be done really, really very carefully.
Yeah, I'm not trying to recommend that everybody run out and
no.
But the reason I'm saying this is that I was just trying to think of books that would be where there would be commonality to maybe, to pivot off of, to say, okay, well, here's something that I read. It's Zev ben Shimon Halevi. He wrote a book. It's a whole commentary on Exodus that I read many years ago. I don't know if I'm looking on Amazon. I don't see it on Amazon, but I've got it over on my shelf. But what was interesting about that book is that it's very close to the type of exegesis that Christianity does to Exodus. So, I understand a lot of Jews might think that, well, that's going to excess. It's too symbolic. But it was
not at all. I mean,
it was interesting to see the parallel there.
Kabbalistic understanding, and Islam does too. I mean, it's not
right. Yeah, the Sufis. Yeah,
that's right. And I think there's an esoteric side to any religion, because there's an esoteric side to life. There's a mystery to the universe. We don't know the greater picture. That's the sin of the Garden of Eden, the attempt by Adam and Eve to try to get to know everything and to become like gods, which we can't. So, I mean, we're images of God. We're not God. In fact, the corruption of a lot of the people we were talking about earlier is that they are trying to be God on earth. I mean, that's the great sin of the Garden of Eden. And a lot of the Kabbalistic research has to do with just those first chapters, right from the creation up to Adam and Eve. And it doesn't really even go beyond that too much.
Yeah, I mean, I understand, there's many different systems, and I'm certainly no expert in this. I did read several books by Gershom Scholem, which were interesting.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And then this one too, the way that he talks about sacred time, sacred space in the Sabbath book. There's a really good book by Mircea Eliade where he does something similar to World Religions, which is really good.
Oh, I've always wanted to read that. That's a classic.
It's really good. Yeah.
It's very influential amongst Orthodox Christians too. I think it's like if you go to like Romania.
Yes, it is. I've got his trilogy over here. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something I want to check out. That's important.
He's an interesting, probably the best comparative religion scholar that I can think of. I don't know what his actual religious views were, but he treats it very well. And I put in the chat there, that's that Exodus commentary that I read that I thought was really fascinating. So you might find that interesting as well.
Well, I just I want to kind of wrap it up. I just want to just share one observation I had, and I brought this up actually to Dr. Jones in my last talk with him, in that the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews was obviously one of the worst crimes of history, in my opinion. It's just the enormity of it, the systematic nature of it, to try to hunt down every single Jewish man, woman, and child and just kill them. There have been atrocities in history, but nothing quite reaches that thorough level, and it was done by a modern state, Germany, and that much of the world turned their back to it, including the United States, and there was a certain level of Christian complicity in it, and obviously there were great people who stood up against it and said, "This is insane. We're not going to kill everybody because they happen to be Jewish. This is just, it's just complete the definition of evil." Mm-hmm. And it was also the biggest social experiment to ever be done up until that point in history. Hopefully nothing will ever reach that level again. But I think that if you look at the Torah, out of evil comes good, because that's how God works. The story of Joseph, they threw him into a snake pit, left him there for dead. He goes through various events which are really interesting. And eventually he becomes the prime minister of Egypt, and he saves his country from a famine. And then you have the brothers come down and they're like starving, and they realize who he is after he reveals himself, and they fall on their face figuring he's going to have them executed because what they did. And he basically forgave them, and he said, "Look, out of evil came good. I'm now here as an instrument of God to help save you and my father and my family and the people of Egypt." And so courses of events work out that way. And I speculate that the Nazi Holocaust, which was, again, the most evil event in history, and it was, by the socialistic, atheistic Nazis, and just, I've written about it, as have a lot of people. I mean, I take a different view on it than the conventional view, but out of that evil came two good things. Firstly, the establishment of the state of Israel, which I think is a miracle. But secondly, the heart of the Christian changed toward Jews. They no longer view the Jews as cursed because of the death of Jesus. They no longer view that idea, which is actually not, it's antithetical, as you say, to biblical understanding of guilt.
Right.
And because the Christian church had a certain level of complicity in the Holocaust because of that view. This is why you had countries like Latin American countries turn their back on Jewish refugees who were trying to get out of Germany. They could have accepted people who were very talented people. I mean, I know I'm generalizing here, but the Jewish people are pretty successful people. I mean, we're skilled in so many areas of endeavor. I mean, in economy and in culture, in the arts, in medicine. I mean, when you're sick, you look to a Jewish doctor. I mean, even Adolf Hitler had a Jewish doctor, right? Because your life is in danger and you want help. And if these countries had accepted the Jewish refugees, they could have been a lot better off today than they are. I mean, they would have invited in people who would have created an enormous success in those civilizations. But they didn't, because they believed that the Jews were Christ killers, and they turned their back on the Jews. So I think that because of that, and by the way, I'm not holding them responsible for the Holocaust. The Holocaust was done by Hitler. But because of that, I think that there was a change in the Christian faith, in the conscience of the Christian. And they realized that this whole idea was wrong. This collective idea that anybody would be guilty 2,000 years later, even if the Jews were back then responsible for killing Jesus, which I don't believe they were, but even if they were, there was something, it was a Jewish affair. It was not something that you can blame the Jewish people for. We're not, eternally cursed over that. So I view that also as something good coming out of evil. And I think we should embrace that as a way of understanding, not just because it's the Jews, but because you can't have that kind of like view of any group of people as evil. You have to judge individuals as good or evil. So,
yeah, I mean, my comment on that would be that my knowledge of, I know about the Vatican rat lines, and I think that's true. There's a good book on the connection between the Vatican and this stuff with regard to, and fascism with regard to, what is that guy's book? It's on Operation Gladio, and he's got several chapters on the papacy and this connection.
That went on with the United States too. I mean, and Russia. I mean, I actually don't even have a bigger problem with that. That's after the fact. I'm talking about the event itself, the Holocaust, how that could have happened, and how at the end.
What I'm saying is that my understanding of the alliance is that the alliance is at the level of, in terms of the Christian, when you said the Christian church, I mean, I think the Vatican was involved in that because they had certain accords with Hitler. Sure. I'm not saying that they wanted all of that to happen. I don't think that they intended that to happen in terms of the Vatican. I'm not a fan of the Vatican. I'm just trying to give my assessment of it. In fact, I don't like Roman Catholicism at all, but yeah, I think that the events probably did have or cause a change in attitude, but I don't think that necessarily there's any collective guilt in any way. In other words, I don't think that Roman Catholics as a group aren't guilty for what the papacy and different. Okay. And I don't think that
it's not about a matter of the papacy or any particular Christian denomination. I'm just talking about generally the heart of the Christian as viewing the Jews in this way contributed to the Holocaust, because it's not that they wanted that to happen. I don't even think the German people necessarily knew what was going on either. Mm-hmm. They fell under the sway of an atheistic totalitarian regime.
Yeah.
And like anyone else, when you've lost your freedom, you look the other way because you want to survive. I mean, I get that. That's there's a psychology to that. I'm just saying that in a sense, the entire world community was turned their back on the Jews implicitly and allowed it to happen because of certain beliefs that are collective and that are wrong. And I see what you're saying. And I think that changed after the war. And I think that's miraculous that it changed. I think that's an intervention by God in terms of correcting something that was wrong. And not just in terms of the Jews, but this whole idea that any group would be held collectively responsible for something. I mean, that's what opens the door to any kind of a genocide.
Yeah.
And it's like we've become more, in a sense, when we believe in a God and we believe ourselves as images of God, we're not as influenced by these kind of pieces of information out there that can make us become like a wolf pack against any group of people. Anyways, but Jay, I mean, I really want to thank you for joining me. Really
Yeah, thank you.
interesting.
Absolutely.
Can you let my listeners and viewers know how they can get your book and where they can hear your programs or anything else about you?
Yeah, all my stuff is over at my website, jaysanalysis.com. And then I have YouTube channel under my name. A lot of the same stuff there. There's a shop of the website. You can get signed copies there for I think $30. But yeah, and there's a subscription service too, where you can get archives and all that for like $4.95 a month. So that's also at the website. And then I'm on a free speech based platform called Rockfin, which I've been promoting lately. So you can find my stuff there as well.
Okay. All right, Jay Dyer. Listen, thanks so much. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely.